Hi everybody, Steven here. If you ever wondered how to deploy a vSAN cluster, but more specifically the vSAN Express Storage Architecture cluster, stick around, that's what I'm going to cover. See you in a bit. Thanks for sticking around, everyone. Okay, so what we're going to do is talk about how to deploy a vSAN cluster, but more specifically the Express Storage Architecture vSAN cluster. Now, I've already done a video on deploying the original storage architecture, and it was pretty straightforward. We're going to do one, I've had a request to do one on the Express Storage Architecture. I'll show you two different ways to do this. We'll use the wizard, the cluster deployment wizard, which makes things a lot easier. And we'll show you how to do it manually in case somebody had disabled that wizard as well. I normally like to throw this out at this point as well. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please subscribe to the channel. By subscribing to the channel, you're supporting the channel. More subscribers, the better. I'm trying to hit that 10,000 mark. I already passed 1,000, which is good. I'd like to get one of those YouTube plaques, but I need 100,000. So please support the channel by subscribing. I also have super thanks enabled. If you want to support it that way, that's totally up to you. Why don't we jump right into it? So let me get my screen here. All right. So I have my environment set up here. It's pretty basic. I've got a Site A data center. You see I have three hosts, three ESXi hosts, just keeping it pretty straightforward and simple. If I look at my host, let's look at host 1. Let me look at under configure, under VM kernel adapters. I got my management VM kernel adapter. That's the VM kernel 0. I also set up a vMotion. So all the hosts are set up like that. I don't have a cluster created. I do have a distributed switch created for my management and vMotion, but I don't have any vSAN networks or anything done. So first step, let's create a cluster. So I'm going to right click on my data center, new cluster, and then at that point, I'm just going to say cluster-01. Give it a name that makes sense. Okay, I'm in my lab environment. I'm not worried about Lifecycle Manager here, so I'm just going to disable that. Now I can enable vSAN at this point if I wanted to, or I can just leave it off. Let me show you just leaving it off, and I'll show you how to turn it on. Okay, so I'll go next. I go next, and I'm done. Okay, so I just created the cluster, and right away you notice it's got the cluster that's created, and under configured, under quick start, it brings me to the cluster quick start wizard here. Now you can click on this skip quick start, and that's it. It doesn't come back. I don't know if they've made a change in that lately or not, but if you click on that, you won't be able to use this again, right? So I'm not going to do that because I'm going to show you using a wizard. So I can go and add hosts if I want to this cluster. Right? Or I can add services here, right? So why don't we, well, it doesn't really matter which one I do, but let's start off with number 1. Let's go and edit the cluster. Now I'm just going to enable vSAN, and I'm going to leave it at that. Now notice enable vSAN Express Storage Architecture is enabled here, okay? Now you only do this on servers that are supported. It's got a very strict hardware compatibility list. Just like the original vSAN had a hardware compatibility list, this one's got an even more stricter one, okay? So you got to be aware of that. Your nodes should be supported. I'm in my lab environment. I don't care. I'm going to say, okay, boom, that's it. I just turned on that service. I'm not going to worry about HA and DRS, all that stuff right now. Just turn it on vSAN. Okay, and that's it. Now I want to add hosts to my cluster. I could drag and drop them if I wanted to, but the point is using this wizard. I'm going to click on add host, and then I could type in the IP address or fully qualified domain name. If the hosts aren't in the inventory of vCenter, this is what I would do here. Since the 3 hosts are already added to the inventory, I already added it to vCenter, I'm just going to go existing hosts, and you see all 3 hosts in there. So, okay, I'll select all the hosts, go next, gives me just a little summary here. I'll go finished, and that's it. And then I just wait, okay? Give it a few seconds, and at that point, it'll add in these hosts, okay? So I might just speed this up a little bit. Actually, I'll pause the recording, so we'll come right back. Okay, we're back. Pretty straightforward, add in the host. It's giving me some warnings here. It says SCSI controller is VMware certified. It's basically it's not telling me that. It's a little misleading, the statement. It's not telling me that it is certified. It's telling me that the SCSI controller has an issue with being VMware certified. In other words, that's a bad thing. I'm in a lab environment. It's actually virtual machines if you watched my channel before. So I'm just going to ignore those. In a production environment, I would not ignore these. Remember when I disabled the lifecycle manager, I said I don't want to manage it with an image. So it's giving me a little warning about that. Not the end of the world. Let's configure the cluster now. All right. So we got our cluster. Notice the hosts are in maintenance mode. See the little icon there, the funny icon? And it says maintenance mode right beside each host. So I'm going to say configure cluster. I'm going to click on that. Now, at this point, this configure cluster is going to create a distributed switch for me, okay? So it's going to create one. So I may as well, what I'm going to do here is, actually, let me cancel this. If I go back to my hosts, and if I go back to configure virtual switches, you'll see I've got a distributed switch already there, and it's got uplinks 1 and 2 assigned to it, okay? And uplinks 1 and 2 are basically hooked up to the physical cards VMNIC 0 and VMNIC 1. If I look at the physical cards, physical adapters each of my servers have, I've got 4 physical adapters in there. Hey, we all know it's virtual, but anyways, these would be representing physical adapters in your real world, right? So you'll see I don't have VMNIC 2 and VMNIC 3. I do not have them assigned to any switches. So and that's what I'm gonna actually do. So in the wizard, I'm gonna say, create a virtual switch, assign VMNICs 2 and 3 to that distributed switch that'll be dedicated for vSAN traffic. If you could do that, that's great. If not, then if you could have a dedicated cards for vSAN, that's actually a good thing, all right? Now notice my cards here says 10 gig. Some of you might say, hey, hang on a second, Steve, Express storage architecture doesn't support 10 gig. Actually, I do see one configuration that does support it, but you know what? I'm in a lab environment, so I don't care, all right? So generally speaking, Express storage architecture wants 25 gig or faster network cards. So always check your compatibility list. Anyways, enough of that. Let's get back into the cluster. So under configure, under quick start, let's go back into configure cluster. So I'm just going to create a distributed switch mirror for me. I'll call it VDS. Oops, I hit the wrong key here. I'll call it VDS-vSAN, virtual distributed switch -vSAN, okay? Then it says, okay, what's my vSAN network going to use? It's going to use that distributed switch. And what port group? That's what it's asking me here. What port group do I want the VM kernel ports to be put on? So this is going to create a VM kernel port for my host that's enabled for vSAN. So I'm going to call this port group PG-vSAN. Port group vSAN. Kind of makes sense. I like that. Now it's asking me, what adapter do you want to use from these servers? And I mentioned before, I'm going to use my 3rd and 4th adapter for the vSAN network. So I'm going to pick that, and it's, again, going on to that distributed switch. I'll click on next. At this point, it's asking me, okay, will you be using a VLAN for your vSAN traffic? If you're not sure about this vSAN or VLAN stuff, watch my video on virtual switches where I cover trunking and VLANing and virtual guest tagging and external switch tagging. So you need to understand that. In my lab environment, I don't really care. In your environment, you may have trunks set up and you might say, oh, my vSAN network is going to use VLAN 20 or something like that. So you got to type in the appropriate number here, right? I'm not worried about that here in my lab environment. I'm not using it, right? What protocol do I want to use for my vSAN network? IP4, IP6, or both? I'm just going to use IP4 because, hey, that's all I need. How do you want to assign the VM kernel port to your vSAN network? Again, you can use DHCP, nothing wrong with that, or you can go static. Now I'm going to say static, and I'm going to type in my IP, 172.20.30.51 for host 1, subnet mask 255.255.255.0. Now the gateway here, if your vSAN network, remember you got all of these servers on a vSAN network, if all these servers are on the same flat vSAN network, same layer 2 network, they're not different subnets, you don't have to specify a gateway. But if you do, let's say you're doing like a stretched site or a stretched cluster or something like that, where you may potentially have a vSAN network that's stretched across multiple layer 2 networks, then you want to specify a gateway. In my lab, I don't need it. I'm going to leave it alone. This is cool. Suppose if you got like 30 servers here you're going to be adding in. You don't have to sit here and type all this in. I'm just going to go autofill, and notice it takes the next number, just increments it by 1, which saves you a lot of time. This is what I really like about the wizard. I could create a vSAN network pretty quick. I'm going to go next. Now this is the settings for vSAN. Okay, what am I doing? Am I doing a single site deployment or a stretch cluster? We're just going to do a single site here. I'll do another video later on down the road on stretch clusters. But anyways, let's just save that. Now, Data at rest encryption. Do you want to do encryption? Now, I don't know if they've changed this. I don't think so. I have not heard anything. This is the only time you can set up encryption, okay, for your vSAN storage, right, in the express storage architecture. Unlike the original storage architecture where you could go back later on and do it. Now with this, I could actually also do encryption with policies as well. I can say, well, this VM is really important. I want to encrypt it. I want to encrypt this one. These VMs, I really don't care. I don't need encryption. But totally up to you, okay? But again, notice this, you cannot modify the data at rest encryption setting after claiming disks on the vSAN ESA enabled cluster. So you need to know if you're going to enable this, yes or no, right? So I select this, it's going to ask me for a key provider, which I don't have, okay? Data in transit encryption. Okay, so that's again across the vSAN network. Do you want to encrypt that? Yes or no? Again, up to you. If I select this, again, I can turn that on. I wouldn't just select this for the sake of selecting it. See if you've got a security policy that actually requires this. You may not. Space efficiency, storage policy, manage compression, right? Now, I'll talk a little bit about, actually, no. You could potentially, notice I got no other nothing here to select, right? But one of the things with the vSAN, the ESXi architecture, and if you watch my videos on it, especially the components and stuff, because we have basically mirror components, or performance, we have a performance leg. It really, performance doesn't get impacted if we're doing like a RAID 5 or RAID 6. Unlike the original storage architecture, everything goes right into the performance leg, which is mirrored and striped. Then it gets offloaded to the capacity leg afterwards, right? So the main thing with the ESA architecture is it can give you a high level of performance, at the same time give you better space efficiency. Like for example, the original storage architecture, if you did a RAID 5 or RAID 6, it basically, you would get write penalties, because that's basically what RAID 5 and RAID 6 is. They basically have write penalties because of the parity. It has to calculate that. Because they kind of get around this with the performance leg, your performance here should be very similar to that to a RAID 1, technically speaking. Fault domains. I'll talk about fault domains, but I'll probably on a separate video. But if I enable this, it actually asks me to create fault domains. Think of a fault domain as racks of servers, right? So I've got, let's say, a failure to tolerate a 1, okay? So I got 3 sets of racks, let's say, right? And I want to be able to have the components go across those 3 racks. So if I get a complete rack failure, it doesn't impact my VMs. So that's an example of a fault domain, maybe rack domains. Again, I'm not going to worry about that right now. Perhaps I'll do a separate video showing you that. Now, remote direct memory access support. If your network cards support this, look at the VMware compatibility site. Notice mine's grayed out. It's because my card doesn't support it. If it did support it, this would be enabled, and I could turn it on, and this could increase your performance. Okay. So again, if you see this as an option, you'll probably want to turn it on. Auto policy management. So some of these things are different than the original storage architecture. Auto policy management. Let's see what this is. If I click on it, based on the type of cluster and the number of hosts, vSAN creates and assigns default data store policies based policies for best capacity utilization after the cluster configuration is completed. This option is only available for ESA. So what this is saying is you're basically saying, let vSAN pick the best storage policy for me, and I want it to be based on space efficiency, okay? In other words, you know, if you could do RAID 5, do RAID 5 type of thing. So that's kind of neat. So that's totally up to you if you want to do that, or if you'd rather have more control over it, you can actually disable that. I'm going to disable it because I don't care, all right? Under host options, these 2 other sections down here have nothing really to do with vSAN. Host options, again, lockdown mode, NTP servers, all that kind of stuff. Enhanced vMotion, again, all this stuff has really nothing to do with vSAN. So these are your main vSAN options. I'm going to click on next, and it comes up and says, I want vSAN to manage my disks, okay? If I select this, notice actually there's no disk here. I want vSAN to manage my disk. If I click on this, vSAN managed disk claims can only be enabled if there is a vSAN compatible disk on the host. So notice I got no compatible disks here. And I kind of did this on purpose. I'm in my lab environment. These are VMs, right? What this is looking for, remember, express storage architecture only supports solid state drives. doesn't support spindle drives. So I got to cancel this. Let me go back to my host. Let me go back into configure storage devices, and let me just get rid of this. And when you look over here, you'll see all my hard drives are coming up as spindle disk, HDD, right? So the ones I want to use for my vSAN will be this 50 gig and these two 100s. Whoops. Why'd you do that? There we go. The 50 gig and two. And I'm going to go in and say mark them as flash devices. Now, and I'll say yes. And I'm going to repeat that on all the three servers here. Come on. Why is it doing that? So I got my 50 and my two 100s. Mark as flash. And you can say, are you sure? You go yes. And I'm going to repeat the same thing on that last host there. I don't know why it's selected them all there. Anyways, there we go. And I'll say mark as flash. And I'll say yes. Now, let me just go back and check that. Yep, there are now marked as flash. Yep, there it is marked as flash. I don't know why it's doing that. Selecting them all. And here we go. Marked as flash. Okay, so they're all good now. Now, okay, I want to warn you about something. You don't want to just do this. Like, so if this is a production environment and all of a sudden I'm looking and going, hey, hang on a second, I got my server here. How come it thinks that it's a spindle disk and not a solid state when it's actually a solid state? I would stop, hit the brakes, and see what's going on and troubleshoot it. Maybe you need a firmware update, a patch, or something like that, right? But again, and I wouldn't just blindly set this to flash. I would never, ever, if it was a spindle disk, go, oh, I'm going to mark it as flash. Never, ever do that, okay, folks? So this is my lab environment. It's, for some reason, sometimes thinks it's a hard drive and not a solid state. So I'm gonna cheat. Don't do that in production, okay? Let me go back to the cluster. We got to start over now, okay? But I can go through it faster. Let's configure it. Again, I'll say my distributed switch here. VDS-vSAN. We'll pick the VDS-vSAN, my port group, PG-vSAN port group. We'll scroll down. So I have to do this all over again because I canceled it out, right? So that's okay. Let's go back into assigning the IPs for my vSAN network, 172.20.30.51. Subnet mask 255.255.255.0. And I'll do autofill. That looks good. I go next. Again, we already talked about all these settings. I'm just going to turn that off. I'm going to go next. Now I can say, okay, I want vSAN to manage these things. Now notice it's not letting me select it because it's coming up and says these disks are incompatible with ESA. That's what it is. Again, a production environment, I'd hit the brakes and say, we got a problem here. My lab environment, I don't care. Remember, I don't have supported hardware for ESA. So I'm going to say, don't worry. Now, what it's showing me here, remember I had a 50 gig disk and 100 gig disk? So it's showing me, it sees those drives are as available, right? Notice I'm viewing it based on the disk model. I could view it based on the host. So now it's showing me host 1 has these 3 disks. One of them is a 50 gig. And I could select them individually if I wanted to, right? I'm going to go back to the disk and model size. So you could look, depending on what view you're more comfortable with. So I'm going to say, yep, I'm going to pick all those, and away you go. Notice it's telling me, it's giving me a warning that I'm picking drives that are not certified for ESA, right? So, and again, a production environment, I would hit the brakes on this one, okay? Now, by the way, when I select I want vSAN to manage disk, yeah, sorry, okay, that's good enough. I'm going to go next, gives me a summary, and I go finish. And at that point, it's going to go out and format those drives, okay? So I'm just going to let this thing run, and we'll come back and check it out, okay? Okay, we're back. That didn't take too long. It took a couple of minutes in my lab environment. The big thing to look for is on this right-hand side where it says configure hosts. You want to see that green check mark. If you see it spinning around, it means it's still working on it. Walk away, take a break. Don't be messing around and stuff, right? So let's look at my data store now. When I click on the data store, there's my vSAN data store, and you see the capacity is about 750 gigs in size, which is basically I got 2 100 gig disks and a 50 gig disk inside each server, so 250 gig per server. And 3 servers, 3 times 250 is 750. Notice we do not have a cache device like we do in the original storage architecture. So you're not wasting basically one drive just for caching, which is a potential point of failure a single point of failure, potential bottleneck for performance. So the express storage architecture to me is what's going to be the one moving forward, right? I would imagine, don't quote me on this, I would imagine the original storage architecture eventually would be discarded and deprecated, right? And that's the original storage architecture would be deprecated and put forward. Okay, now that was pretty simple, okay, because I used the wizard. Now, what happens if the wizard's not available to you? Because again, I know I've used the wizard here, but again, remember I showed you could have skipped wizard? Suppose if somebody did that, how do you configure the cluster at that point? Stick around, I'm going to show you. I'm going to reset my environment, and we'll come back and see how we can do this manually, okay? All right, we're back. I reset my lab environment. If you're wondering, I'm using VMware Workstation for my hosts here, and I just use snapshots so I can flip back and forth pretty quick to do stuff like this. And I canceled the task because when I revert it back, it starts to go to VMware site to download patch definitions, and I just canceled that. So let's create a cluster again. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to right-click, say New Cluster, and I'll call it again Cluster -01. I don't care about Lifecycle Manager. I'm going to disable that. I can enable vSAN right here if I wanted to, right? No problems. Or I could do it after the fact if I want to. So I'm going to enable it. I'll enable ESA, right? So I'll go next. And at that point, I go finish. Okay? So I just created the cluster. Now, the first thing it does, it brings me to the cluster wizard. The whole point of this one now is, suppose if somebody said to skip cluster wizard. And then at that point, what can you do? You can still add hosts if you want to using the cluster wizard, which is really nice, but I'm not going to do that, okay? We're going to do everything manual. Let's pretend the cluster wizard doesn't exist, right? So I'm just going to basically drag and drop each of these hosts into the cluster, like I would do normally if I never had this cluster wizard, okay? So there we go. I added them in, and it's updating some vSAN configuration. Okay. Now we haven't fully configured vSAN yet. Actually, if I click on the data store, it may show me a vSAN data store, but there's no size. Don't worry about those. Some of these errors I'm getting on vCenter. It's my lab environment. I don't care. I would care in the real world about errors like that. Okay. So I just wait for this thing to complete, doing its thing here. It's updating vSAN information. So now, let's just forget about the wizard. The wizard doesn't exist, right? What I need to do now is I need to go on each of my hosts and create a VM kernel port enabled for vSAN. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to create a port group for vSAN to use. Now, I showed you in the previous part of the video, I've got a distributed switch. I could, if I want to, utilize this distributed switch or create a new one for vSAN. Just since I'm being lazy, I'm just going to use this distributed switch. I'm going to create a port group on it for vSAN. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to say distributed port group, new distributed port group, and I'm just going to call it PG-vSAN. And I'll go next. And again, I'm just going to accept the defaults here. Again, in the real world, you would probably have to specify a VLAN here, depending on if you're doing trunking or whatever, right? I'm not worried about that. Again, if you're not sure about what this stuff means, watch my virtual switch video. I really go into depth on it. And we'll go next. I just created a port group there for vSAN. Okay, beautiful. Let's go into each host now, and let's go in and ignore the red mark there, okay? Because it's probably telling me something about vSAN being partitioned or what. Well, let's look at it. vSAN network alarm. Again, I've enabled vSAN, but it can't find a vSAN network, so it's complaining about that. That should clear up, okay? So now I could have not enabled vSAN, create my VM kernel ports, then enable vSAN. I probably would not see that error, but it doesn't really matter which order you do it in. Let me pick my first host, go configure, and I'm going to go to, actually, before you do that, I forgot to do one thing. Let's go back to that port group. Let's go back to that port group, vSAN. Let's edit the settings on it. And I'm going to go under teaming and failover. Right now, it's using all my uplinks. I'm going to move it down. I only want it to use uplinks 3 and 4 for my vSAN network, okay? That's my 3rd and 4th physical NIC inside my host. Again, so I'm just doing that because of my environment. So you'll have to set it up appropriately for yours. So let's go back in the host, configure. We'll go to VM kernel adapters. We'll add networking. I'm going to say create a VM kernel network. I can say create a new switch or whatever, use an existing switch. Notice again, I got my port group vSAN here, right? So I'm going to say use this existing port group. I will go next. Now it's asking me, now your MTU size, get the MTU size from the switch, right? Or I can go custom. It's best practice to crank this up to a large maximum transmission unit size, like 9,000. But your environment, your physical environment needs to support that, needs to support it end to end, or else it's going to fragment things. So you want to talk with the network guys. Do I have jumbo frames enabled for 9,000 bytes for my MTU? And you want to do that for vSAN. My lab environment, I'm just going to leave it alone, okay? Notice over here, I'm going to enable this for vSAN. I'm going to go next. Now, what's the IP address? So I'll type in 172.20.30.51, subnet mask 255. 25. Man, I can't type today. Let's try that again. Okay. Now, I mentioned before about gateways and stuff like that. If by chance, let's say my vSAN network's on different subnets, so I got servers that are on different subnets and the vSAN network's going to be on different subnets, these hosts need to talk to each other. They need to go through a gateway. Notice it says override default gateway for this adapter. What it's going to use is your default gateway of your host, the IP stack of your host. So it's going to use that gateway. If it's different, which it probably would be, you're going to want to specify one for the vSAN network here. I don't care. I'm a flat network, so I'm going to leave this. I'm going to click next, and I'm going to hit finish. And I'm going to repeat that process for my 3 servers here. Now you can see that not using the wizard makes things difficult, right? Not difficult, it's not the end of the world, but it makes things much more cumbersome. And then I'll just go next. And I'm finished. And then last but not least, this guy, add networking, VM kernel. Again, this takes a little bit of time without the wizard, right? So the wizard, I'm not really a wizard type guy, to be honest with you. I usually skip wizards because they were never around in the beginning. So I just got used to not doing it. So this method I'm showing you right now is generally how I traditionally create a vSAN network. And it's a lot more work, right? But now I'm actually a big fan of the wizard because it goes so fast. There, I created my vSAN network here. So at that point, what do we need to do? So we got our vSAN cluster here. Again, it's still complaining about this. This will probably refresh in a minute and it'll disappear. I'm just going to leave it alone. I'm going to select my cluster. I'm going to go into configure now. Okay. Notice my data store. Let's click on my data store vSAN. It's still 0. Okay. There's nothing there. Let's go back into here. Select the cluster. Go to configure. Let's go all the way down to disk management. Now at that point, did I change my disk? Oh no, it came up and says, yeah, there's no disk for it to claim. Okay, there's a reason for that. If you watch my other video, let me go to my host here. Let's go back into it. It thinks I don't have any solid state drives in here. Let's go to configure storage devices. Let's get this out of the way. Yeah, it doesn't see any solid state here. So I'm going to pick my 50 and my 2 100s and mark them as flash. Okay, let me repeat this. Generally, this step you shouldn't have to do in the real world. And if you do have to do this in the real world, there might be something wrong. So I would not really do this. I would stop and talk to the vendor that I bought the servers from and the drives from and say, why is it not being recognized as a solid state disk, okay? So this is just in case you got no choice and you have to do this. So I'm just checking them. Yeah, they're all flash, they're all flash. Great. So remember, let me just refresh this, that bottom one. There we go. So remember, express storage architecture only uses solid state, right? So let's go into my cluster, go back to configure, and then we'll go all the way back down to disk management. Then now notice it's claim unused disk. I can go view disk. I could go in, view disk if I want to, and I can add disks on a per host basis if I want to, okay? Or I can do it all at a cluster. I'm making a new cluster. It's easier for me to do it at the cluster level instead of doing it one at each host. Now, what this is going to do is claim all the hosts, all the disks that it finds in each of these hosts. So if you go, yeah, that's what I want to do, great. I can say claim unused disk. If it says, if that's not what I want to do, and I want to cherry pick each one from different hosts, then you'll have to do it manually. So I'm going to click on this. Now it's coming up and it's telling me, it's giving me a warning here. It says this 100 gig disk here is incompatible and the 50 gig disk is incompatible. It's saying it's incompatible with vSAN Express Storage Architecture. In the real world, I would stop at this point and say, what's going on? We got a problem here. My lab environment, I don't care. All right. So you shouldn't see this in the real world. Now it's asking me what disks do I want to claim. Now again, you could view it based on disk model and size. So I only got a 50 gig, 100 gig, or you could view it based on the host. You've seen this before. So I could go to host 1 and I could pick and choose the disk I want from host 1, go to host 2 and host 3. Again, this makes a storage pool. Okay. I'm going to go back to the disk model and size. I'm going to select all those. There we go. So it's coming up and it's showing me your vSAN capacity will be 750 gigs. Again, there's no cache devices, right? Which is kind of nice. I'll click on create. And at that point, it's going to go out and format this. So let's just wait and see. I'm going to pause the recording. We'll come back when it's done. It'll take a few minutes. Okay, everybody, it's done. Didn't take too long. Those red arrows disappeared on the cluster, but I still have a couple warnings here, but it says vSAN hardware compatibility issue and vSAN build recommendation. Remember, I'm using VMs. Here's VMware Workstation. I'm using VMs here, right? So they're obviously not supported, and that's why it's complaining. So I can say, yeah, whatever, I'll ignore it. Again, in the real world, I wouldn't ignore these. I'd be saying, okay, what's going on here? What components aren't supported? So I would want to fix it. All right. We'll see my vSAN data store. Again, it's about 750 gigs inside, and I can deploy a VM on this if I want to. I won't bother demoing that. I've done it in the past. You may be asking yourself, how do I add more storage to it after I've done this? That'd be a good question. And you can watch the video. I'll leave a link for that. So that's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this. It was pretty straightforward. I guess the moral of the story here is use the cluster wizard. It can save you a lot of time. But in case you can't, somebody's disabled it, then at least you know how to do it manually, okay? So give it a thumbs up if you found this entertaining. Please subscribe to the channel if this is stuff that you're interested in. It helps support the channel so I can do more videos and get stuff out. Leave comments down below on stuff you'd like to see. I'll do my best. I answer back to everybody that leaves a comment, okay? Thanks again. See you in the next one. Bye now.